Well, we've been learning a bit more today about some of the promises Boris Johnson made behind the scenes to try and reduce that rebellion last night, because it looks as though it could actually have been quite a bit bigger, not 101, maybe 120, maybe 130. And we now know definitively that behind closed doors he promised those MPs, trying to peel them off from the rebellion, that he would definitely recall Parliament if there were to be a change in the rules once Parliament rises tomorrow, if he were to try to change the rules during the Christmas recess, and they would definitely get a look at any such rule change before it happened. We also know that he told some MPs that the whole business of the passes, the things they don't like to call vaccine passports, that would go no further as a policy. And what we're beginning to see today is the degree to which what the party was doing there last night, the rebels who were voting against him, the degree to which they might be succeeding. They wanted to box in the Prime Minister on COVID policy. They think, they hope they might have done something on that front, but they're watching him carefully. And they wanted to jolt him, to change the entire way he governs.
Is the party over for you now, Prime Minister?
The question prompted by last night's giant rebellion.
The noes to the left, 126.
Wow. Ouch, one MP responded. Plan B carried with Labour votes. Boris Johnson's party in revolt.
I think the message to Boris is the party now expects a much more measured, a much more thoughtful policy on COVID matters. That, you know, if he's got any ideas about Plan C, he better think very, very hard before he implements a Plan C.
Because?
Well, because the party won't put up with it.
As Christmas looms, the army and volunteers joined health professionals at Chester Cathedral providing booster jabs. But questions are being raised about whether the Plan B Boris Johnson strained to get through the Commons last night is any match for the scale of the Omicron threat.
It's probably the most significant threat we've had since the start of the pandemic. And I'm sure, for example, that the numbers that we see on data over the next few days will be quite staggering.
At the Downing Street press conference, you could hear the Prime Minister pulling one way and his chief medical advisor pulling the other as they were asked, should you now avoid parties?
Think carefully before you go. What kind of an event is it? Are you likely to meet people who are vulnerable? Are you going to meet loads of people you haven't met before? And get a test.
Don't mix with people you don't have to for either work or for the sort of family things that really matter to you.
Such was the size of the Tory revolt last night. The Prime Minister's Plan B only got through because of Labour's support. And Keir Starmer today was keen to claim the credit for that.
The Prime Minister is so weak that without Labour votes last night, vital public health measures wouldn't have got through. But this country can't... Says it's not true. Oh, God. I haven't got... It's not true. He's so socially distant from the truth. He thinks that that's not true. I don't know where to...
We won that vote last night with Conservative votes, as I told the House.
Classic Boris Johnson wordplay, but some in his own party say last night was a warning. He must change his routine.
In the course of the last year, the typical response is, well, something's gone wrong. Well, it's priced in. Boris lives to different rules. So all that's gone. I think all that's gone.
He's now got to live to normal governing rules.
I think the government's got to live to normal rules, which means more decisive, more effective government than sometimes we've seen in the last year.
A lot of your MPs say it wasn't just about COVID passes, it was about you. It was about your leadership, and they want you to change.
I'm certainly not going to change the policies that have led to the fastest vaccine rollout in Europe.
A new photo surfaced from last year of a party that appears to break COVID rules. This one at Tory HQ in honour of the party's London mayoral candidate, Sean Bailey. The latest in a series of embarrassments which many feel Boris Johnson could have managed better or has himself caused.
The question really, in my mind, for Boris over Christmas is, how am I going to reorganise my system so we don't make these mistakes anymore and we can cope with the new crises? That's the key issue.
New people and a new way of working.
I think new people and a new way of working is going to be is the conclusion he's going to come to, let alone the rest of us.
The City of London this lunchtime emptied. The government's chief medical advisor said stark government messaging on Omicron was reducing social contact. But if Boris Johnson did decide we needed tougher measures, would he dare to take on a party in revolt?
Well, joining me now is Professor Steve Riker, who's a behavioural scientist at the University of St Andrews. He's advised both the UK and Scottish governments on their response to the coronavirus crisis. Professor Riker, welcome to the programme. So we have a situation where the Prime Minister would struggle to introduce further restrictions, even if he wanted to, politically. And yet the Chief Medical Officer is telling people clearly, don't mix with people if you don't have to. What impact is this going to have on behaviour?
Well, I think the problem is this. I mean, clearly today's figures are a game changer. They tell us that the Omicron wave is not a prospect, it's with us. And of course, I agree with the Prime Minister in this, that we've got to go and have a booster vaccine as soon as possible. But the problem is that even if you manage to get that booster today, it will be nearly Christmas. It will be 10 days before the effects kick in. And given that it's doubling every 2 days, that means there will be 32 times as much infection by Christmas Day. So clearly we've got to do something now. And as Sir Mark Walbert said earlier, the one thing that you can do is to limit contact. That's the thing that will bring infection down. We've got to find a way of doing that. And I think it's deeply problematic that the Prime Minister is in a position where he can't say to people, as the Chief Medical Officers did, look, just don't go out and socialise if you don't want to. He couldn't say, don't go to nightclubs if you want to meet your loved ones at Christmas. And I think that leads to mixed messaging, which is really problematic, because the clear message that needs to go out to everybody is, yes, get your booster. That will work in a few weeks' time. But now, to stop the new variant taking over, be cautious, be careful, don't socialise unless you have to.
Okay. The tone of that press conference earlier seemed to be encouraging the public to lock themselves down. And certainly when you look at transport figures or restaurant bookings being cancelled, some people are doing that. How sustainable is it, though?
Well, certainly some people are, and there was a poll out which said that already 17% of people have changed their plans, and another 39% are thinking of so doing. So a majority of people have either changed plans or are thinking of doing so. But I think it's useful to think back to last year, where there was a very similar debate going on, because the government wasn't confident that people would put up with restrictions. It decided to loosen the restrictions to allow us to meet for 5 days in 3 households, but advised caution, and it hoped the advice would actually win the day. But what you found very quickly is the messaging from relaxing the restrictions was far stronger than the messaging of what ministers said. So immediately, nearly twice as many people began to plan Christmas and began to plan having interactions. So the problem is you've got 2 messages at the same time. The message of what that comes out of their mouths and the message of what they're actually doing, or rather not doing, in terms of restrictions. And I think we've just got to get over to people just how serious the situation is. We are in a situation where there are going to be, as people say, eye-watering numbers. We're in a crisis. Right. And we've got to send out the clearest and strongest message. And I think that has to mean policy, because if you don't have the policy, people think, well, it can't be that serious if they're still allowing it to go on.
Yeah. And what about the impact of these parties at Number 10 and Conservative Party headquarters? What sort of impact is that going to have on how people feel? Because there are lots of people who say, well, I don't know, you weren't taking it that seriously last time round, so why should I?
Well, it has a contradictory effect. So what you found after Cummings was a dramatic loss of trust. The government was no longer seen as on our side, they were seen as them. And so we lost trust in them and they lost influence. But at the same time, what you found was that many people were beginning to adhere despite the government. You found that people were beginning to say, I don't want to be like that. I want to follow the rules. I want to look after my community. Now, that's a consolation, but it's a meager consolation. You don't want people in the midst of a huge national crisis adhering despite the government. You want a government that can lead us through that crisis. And sadly, the government has lost that moral authority and therefore, in a sense, can't do its job of telling us the difficult things. Nobody wants to hear that, unfortunately, we've got to do something and we've got to change our behaviours or else we're going to be in deep, deep trouble. Nobody wants to hear it, but the role of good government is to tell us the things we need to hear, not necessarily the things we want to hear.
Professor Riker, very quickly, not everyone can afford to self-lockdown. If you run a restaurant or you're in a service sector job, you can't just stay at home right now. So how do we deal with that?
Well, that's an absolutely critical point. If you want to tell people to do the right thing, it's not enough to tell them to take responsibility and take personal responsibility. First of all, you need to give them clear information about what they need to do, and we're not getting that. And secondly, you need to give them the support to do the right thing. We've seen throughout the pandemic that people have not been able to self-isolate because they don't have the funds. So if you have restriction, you also need support. You need support to businesses, and you need support to individuals. And the point is that if you give that support, you then have a government that people see not just as waving a stick at them, but supporting them, and they're more likely to go along with those measures. So both for practical reasons and to win support and trust, we absolutely need to see that any restriction is matched by support to individuals and businesses. It's crucial. Without that, nothing will work.
OK, that's very clear. Professor Riker, thank you very much for joining us on the programme.